Hi, my name is Wade Frazier. This is October 29th, 2025, 7:30 a.m. So today I want to talk about free energy and where it comes from. And it's a good question. So it's when free energy theorists and inventors talk about, free energy, or as Brian O'Leary started calling it, new energy. A legitimate question is, well, where's this energy coming from? And so, anyway, today I'm going to discuss that issue. When I did that interview with those Green Party activists over the summer, one of them brought up, the similar issue is, when you say free energy, windmill or a solar panel theoretically are free energy because all it's doing is capturing energy, which ultimately comes from the fusion that's happening in our sun's core. And but you have to spend money, energy in order to build the devices that captures the energy. So in that regard, they would say, well, that's not free energy. You have to spend energy to get the energy. Like that's starts getting into concepts called energy return on investment. So you invest energy into building something or extracting something, and then you get energy back out of it. And what's your return on energy? Uh, I don't want to go too far afield here, but again, the initials are EROI, energy return on energy invested. And 100 years ago in East Texas, to extract a barrel of oil, or you could extract 100 barrels of oil with the cost of one barrel of oil. So it had a 100 to 1 EROI. Globally, EROI is down to less than 20, I believe. And stuff like fracking, tar sands, these all have EROIs like 5 and 2. And the guys who actually invented that concept thinks that society needs at least an EROI of 10 to be viable. So anyway, so these so-called new energy sources like tar sands and fracking are really the dregs of Earth's hydrocarbon deposits, and which will also run out soon. So those are no answers, and so it just has put off the day of reckoning a little longer. But free energy, again, as popularly conceived, Nikola Tesla, these kind of people. What's that? What's the source of that energy? And that's what I'm going to discuss in this video. Um, it's basically unrecognized by orthodox science. Um, Einstein's protege, David Bohm, hypothesized this energy source. He estimated that 1 cubic centimeter of empty space had all the energy in it of the observable universe if we knew how to tap it. Jean Manning, who was a free energy journalist, she collected around 30 names for this alleged energy source. And orgone is one of them, all sorts of names. And in fact, I'll use zero point field. And zero point field just means that electrons at their lowest orbit. So whatever this energy is, it's not getting an electron or chemical energy. Again, oil, what we get from oil is all chemical energy. Basically, it's electron energy. So zero point is other than electron energy. It's not coming from the potential energy in an electron as it orbits the nucleus of an atom. Orthodoxy dismisses it. They admit there's a zero point field, but they don't say that there's any practical energy that can be obtained from it. Again, Einstein's protege Bohm disputed that, and that's all I'll get into. He's not the only guy. Um, in my work, again, my God, almost 20 years ago, I was asked to write an essay on some aspects of the free energy issue. And off the top of my head, I came up with these levels of free energy awareness, from ignorance to denial to fear to acceptance to pursuing it to acknowledging it to actually using it. So I had something like 20 levels or something. And one level I call level 3, and this is the level where scientists generally reside and so-called experts. And these are the people who vigorously deny that free energy is possible. In fact, they usually cite the laws of physics. And then they say that any evidence of organized suppression is a conspiracy theory, so it can be safely dismissed. Um, Brian O'Leary likes saying that there are no laws of physics, and we only have theories. And even using the word law is a conceit. It's more like organized religion than it is science to actually use a word like law in describing our theories. And when my friend witnessed an anti-gravity demonstration, and the so-called law of gravity becomes something else, doesn't it? A rather incomplete theory. The funny thing is my friend who got his underground technology show doesn't even believe in so-called zero-point energy, but I suspect that's what he was witnessing. In fact, I'll dish a little more on his underground show. When he was abducted, the people who abducted him didn't do it like in the movies where they, put a bag over his head and throw him in a van. They actually didn't manhandle him. But as my friend said, the way they sequestered him and abducted him was more compelling in ways than if they had put a bag over his head. And again, these people who gave him that show risked their lives to do that. And so I purposely not known very much about this show. But I know that free energy was demonstrated, anti-gravity was demonstrated, and a whole host of technologies that are not on the market. My guess is that most of what my friend saw was developed by reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology. That's my guess. Um, anyway, but the bottom line orthodoxy is that orthodox science today doesn't know what energy is and has no idea where it came from. So there's this whole thing called the Big Bang. So the whole universe came out of nothing in an instant and still expanding. But what happened before that? Who knows? So anyway, it seems like a warmed over version of Book of Genesis, let there be light. Right? And so anyway, so where did the energy come from? They don't know. And what energy is, they don't know. In fact, only scientists how to say it, the greatest scientists admitted their ignorance. Feynman and Heisenberg said that we don't know what energy really is. All that science can do is describe what it does. So it really doesn't know what it is. And even today, so in orthodox circles, it is suspected that dark matter, dark energy, and the cosmological constant are all fudges to preserve Einstein's relativity equations. And so, and that's similar to when Isaac Newton came up with his theory of gravity. The orbit of Mercury was an aberration, and there were people who proposed that there was a phantom planet that could account for the aberrations of Mercury's orbit. Then when Einstein came up with his general theory of relativity, it obviated the need to have a phantom planet. Anyway, I think that if these technologies come into the open and are publicly used, science, orthodox physics is just going to get junked. It's kind of like start over. And like string theory is another one that has literally no empirical support for it. And I've seen it derided as fairy tale physics, and so, theoretical, physics with no data behind it. These people say it's not even science. It's sort of like this pretty theorizing, but science is supposedly you test it against real world evidence. I mean, that's in theory how science is supposed to work. And so when I see scientists dismiss, free energy and zero-point fields and stuff with their laws of physics objection, I consider that pretty shaky, and particularly when they can't answer the most basic questions around energy, which is where did it come from and what is it? So anyway, in my previous video, I sort of gave a very abbreviated version of my journey and the energy pursuit. And again, my life was ruined in my hometown of Ventura, California, back in the late 1980s. and I left in 1990 and have not been back. But soon before I left, a close friend of mine who was an advisor in my days with Dennis, our Ventura company, he ended up visiting free energy inventors, and one of the inventors he visited was a man named Sparky Sweet. And what happened was, soon before I left my hometown, one day he told me about his visit with Sparky. He didn't say it was Sparky. He didn't say who it was, when it was, where it was, but he described this inventor who had this prototype, free energy prototype. And again, my friend was actually an internationally renowned expert in electricity. And anyway, he goes and visits Sparky. And what I didn't know for 20 years was that Sparky lived only about an hour's drive from Ventura. And so, and Sparky had a front row seat to what happened to us, and he knew all about what was happening to us, which was horrifying. But Sparky was having his own horror story. And anyway, so my friend who visited Sparky, Sparky demonstrated his device to him, and Sparky even said, "Watch this," because Sparky's even going, "This shouldn't work." And so what happened was he got his solid state magnetic for energy device sort of chugging along, and then he said, "Watch this," and he took a wire and sort of looped it into it, and my friend said it should have shorted out. But what happened instead is the thing went into overdrive and started cranking all this energy out, and actually ice formed on the device, and it was cranking this energy out. I'll never forget the awe in my friend's voice as he's describing what he watched. It was probably the most amazing sight of his lifetime was watching that device work. Um, and Sparky wrote some papers. And again, so I think the pattern I'm going to use my process is going to be right. I've written an outline of this talk. In fact, I'm reading it. That's why I see my eyes probably darting around. I'm reading it as I do this as an outline for my discussion. And then what's going to happen is I will post this on my Substack site and my own website, and people will be able to take links to see exactly what I'm talking about. So, in Sparky's papers, you read Sparky's papers that he published on this. And Sparky was cryptic, though. So Sparky kept secret his process for conditioning his magnets to do this. Sparky was a career scientist at General Electric, had a doctorate in magnetics, was probably helped by Gabriel Crone, who was kind of a legend in the field. And again, in Sparky's retirement, he developed his free energy prototypes. And in fact, when my friend visited him, Sparky admitted that he mailed off working prototypes of his device to the leading energy institutions, expecting he'd get the ticker tape parade. And the opposite happened. His harassment, in fact, he never got any acknowledgement from these energy institutions that they even received it, but his harassment began right after that. And Sparky was hounded to the end of his life, which was probably an untimely end. Yeah, he got death threats. In fact, Britain said he had murder attempts, which is normal in this field. But in Sparky's papers, you'll read that again, mind-bending concepts like negative electricity and this kind of stuff. And but he basically said that there's really no such thing as nothing. So empty, it's kind of like what Bohm said: empty space isn't empty. And so Sparky's theories, I'll call it zero point field again. So I think he was talking about the zero point field, which Gene Manning came up with 30 names for what various scientists and inventors have called this over the years, for more than a century. And Einstein, when he proposed his special theory of relativity, it obviated the need for what they called the ether. Because before Einstein, light could act as a wave, and so it must be a wave in something. And so there was this supposed ether that light propagated through. And anyway, and Einstein with the special theory, he sort of did away with the need for a for an ether. The problem was though, is when he came 10 years later, when he came up with his general theory of relativity and how gravity would bend space and time, Einstein realized that if space is bent, then something's bent. It's not just emptiness. There's not nothing. It is something's being bent. So anyway, Einstein kind of resurrected his concept of an ether eventually because he realized that there was something there. And so that something, and again, dark matter, dark energy, 0 point field, or I'll call it something. And anyway, it can be considered pretty, all this pretty theorizing, like string theory, all these wonderful conceptions, but don't have any evidence for them. But there's evidence for Einstein's stuff, and in fact, Sparky's device worked. It put out 1.5 million times the energy that went into it. I mean, pretty impressive. Well, ice is forming on it. And so, anyway, in Greer's movie, The Lost Century, that came out a couple of years ago, he's got a segment on Sparky. And Sparky's device also produced anti-gravity effects. And Brian, when he was an astronaut, he met Sparky back when he was still with NASA. And so he had known Sparky for a long time. And so, and again, my friend didn't tell me who, what, or when about Sparky's demonstration, but the next year when I met Brian O'Leary, I was picking him up from a conference to take him to his talk, where his talk was about the need for a new science, which is that a materialistic science is inadequate really to deal with reality. And so he said we needed a new science. Anyway, within 5 minutes of meeting Brian, I found out he was getting his feet wet in the free energy field at that time. He had just spent a weekend with Tom Bearden, and I asked him about this inventor who had his prototype that ice formed on it, that his wife had Alzheimer's, and Brian said, "Oh yeah, Sparky Sweet." And so anyway, what my friend didn't tell me the year before, Brian gave me the answer, but I promptly forgot all about it. In fact, it was another 11 years later when I had my epic note trading session with Brian that I asked him about that guy, and he told me about Sparky's final days. And Sparky was harassed, I mean, death threats. In fact, apparently at least one murder attempt. And in fact, Brian told me that, well, even before, so even back in the 80s, when Sparky was trying to get the interest of the energy institutions. Oh, he had their interest all right, but not the kind of interest that Sparky was hoping to get. Kind of like Dennis Lee. Dennis Lee thought he'd get a ticker tape parade for bringing his heat pump to the electricity market there in Washington State. But his heat pump saved 85% over the electric heating that was prevalent in Washington State. That was too much conservation, so they wiped it all out, and that's what I sort of covered in my previous video. But Sparky was actually at the grocery store near his home, and he was accosted by one of these men in black types who showed Sparky a photograph of Sparky like in his kitchen, somehow taken to the walls of his home. And basically he delivered this picture that Sparky had no idea how he could have taken this, how this picture could have been taken. Basically said, "Sparky, we're watching you and we advise you to stop." And again, back in 2001, when Brian and I had our epic note trading session, I asked Brian, "What happened to that old guy?" And he told me about Sparky's last days. And Sparky had actually had a secret lab in the Mojave Desert where he developed his prototypes. And in fact, what happened was that Sparky was delivered a package full of photographs taken from inside his home, and somehow, and it was our final warning. It says, "This is our final warning, Sparky. You better stop." And Sparky actually fled into hiding in the Mojave Desert there. In fact, Brian visited him in his hiding place. And again, it wasn't secret from the guys that run the world. So, but this is what you can't sneak past them. But anyway, so Sparky, Brian visited Sparky, and Sparky went back home and probably had a heart attack and died. And in fact, right after he died, some people showed up to his house and seized all of his equipment, all of his papers, cleaned it all out, and took it away. And in Greer's movie, you can see people describing what happened. And in fact, Brian almost died of a heart attack the year after I met him when he ran a UFO conference, and the military tried to recruit him to do classified research with UFOs. And in fact, Brian believed that they tried to kill him. In fact, he had this heart attack, but it was a strange heart attack, and it was it was likely exotic tech that gave Brian his heart attack. And this is also in this realm, this is normal. And anyway, and so Sparky was hounded to a grim end. And Brian said that Sparky got in way over his head, was very tired by his life's end. And Sparky lived to be 85, I think, so he had a long life, but the last 10 years of his life were pretty grim, and Sparky was just trying to help. He just wanted to provide it. Now, Sparky, though, was like most inventors. He was, tried the capitalist approach, investor, et cetera. And Sparky was actually concerned about collapsing the stock market if energy became free, et cetera. And well, it would collapse capitalism, but no way we'll miss it. And that's kind of my point in my work. And but Sparky, that was the first time I'd heard about this kind of stuff. When I was with Dennis for the first stint, it was, super heat pumps and the best engine in the local powering automobile. It wasn't, 0 point energy. So that was the first time I'd really heard about 0 point energy. And then again, several years later, my friend gets kidnapped and shown underground technology show where he sees anti-gravity free energy, a whole host of stuff looked like a magic show. And there's others. So in fact, the same day that Brian and I had our epic no trading session in 2001, as we were in the California governor's office trying to convince the governor he lost his job because of Enron was screwing California. We were trying to say, hey, Gray Davis, how about free energy and solve all your problems? And they almost ran us out of town for daring to try to get the attention of the governor. And anyway, it's kind of a funny story. But anyway, so the same day, though, I met a guy named Mark Cummings, who was also with us. In fact, he and I were the youngsters. In fact, Mark's a couple years younger than I am. And anyway, Mark, a couple years later, Brian, when he started the new energy movement, I heard Mark talk about his experience. And then one of Mark's friends published an account which I've actually reproduced on an Avalon site about what Mark went through. And Mark was a physicist, got his degree at Berkeley, worked at Lawrence Berkeley there and right there in the Bay Area. And he developed a 0 point a 0 point prototype with piezoelectric cell. And again, he actually had his mystical awakening, which is really common with these inventors and stuff. Einstein, all these people have these mystical experiences that's how they came up with their amazing breakthroughs, etc. And Mark invented a free energy prototype in the basement on his own. In fact, he told his boss about it. He wasn't trying to be secretive about it, but anyway, he got it going. And the next day, he comes into work and there's places crawling with cops. He gets fired. And then Brian was young, like 24 years old, and he actually thought he'd get another job in the Berkeley system and went to the employment office. And then he got arrested, abducted, taken underground, and interrogated because Mark didn't get it yet. And then what happened was that after a few days he's released, and what the heck was that all about? And Mark was indignant. This is America. You can't do this kind of stuff. Haha. And so anyway, what happens is Mark moves to Southern California under an assumed name, hiding out, and he's going to sneak past him. And he orders the equipment and stuff, and he's got he's set up another lab, and he's going to do it. He's going to do it again. And one day he leaves his house for a couple hours, he comes back, and the whole lab's cleaned out. And at that point, Mark, to his credit, he realized he was in way over his head. And he wisely ceased his efforts. And then fast forward another decade. One of Elizabeth Rauscher was a famous physicist who taught at Berkeley. In fact, Mark was one of her pupils. And one of my friends was a scientist who was a colleague of Rauscher's. They had actually written papers together, et cetera. And when he saw the account I had published of Mark's adventures, he asked Elizabeth. He said, "Elizabeth, this story about Mark, and what do is that real?" Elizabeth said, "Oh yeah, it happened just like Mark said." And anyway, and then what happens is few years later, I got contacted by this friend, and Elizabeth had built her own free energy prototype. Ha! And I was, he asked me on her behalf if it was safe to come forward with it. I said, no, it's not safe to come forward with that stuff. And in fact, Elizabeth also was a very talented psychic, remote viewer, etc. Like Brian, again, like my mentor. This is really typical. These people, the leading edge scientists, are usually very talented psychically, and they don't even often they don't even realize that they are. But that's what sort of these amazing, their amazing breakthroughs often come from is very close cousin. In fact, I think it is psychic ability. But they also have these super high IQs and stuff that can process it. They can handle that insight and make it practical. Come up with a free energy prototype or the world's best engine for powering an automobile, this kind of thing. And and one of the things that, and then I got James Gilliland. So, over 20 years ago, actually 20 years ago this year, I visited James Gilliland for the first time, his ranch there at Mount Adams, where I watched UFOs fly over, several times. And it was amazing, amazing to watch these UFOs fly over. But anyway, so what happens is, in fact, I got to put this on pause for just a second. Anyway, so James, who again has this ranch at Mount Adams, where you go there, you will see unexplainable aerial phenomena, and then some. And so, I mean, it's kind of a mecca for that stuff. And so I've been there several times. Never was disappointed. In fact, yeah, people I went with were never the same again after watching UFOs light up. Anyway, so James worked with a scientist named Max, and he had a device very similar to Sparky's. It got cold when it ran, cranked out the energy, this kind of thing. And in fact, Max and many scientists studied it, etc. Again, boggled their minds. And Max said, "If you can explain how this works, it's yours. I'll give it to you." And nobody could. It's like, again, these technologies defy current notions of physics. And this is, we don't know much. And so anyway, so James and Max actually tried to get it out there. They tried to develop it and stuff. And the usual, the spoofs came running, people died, untimely deaths. And James and Max realized they were in over their heads. And then they wisely ceased their efforts. And I could tell more stories like that. And it's just, this is what happens. If you get involved in this area, you're taking your life into your hands. You're risking your life to play these games of trying to get this stuff. If you're one guy, if you're a small group, you're an easy mark. They will just take you out. And again, they'll buy you out, and if you often you won't even know that you were bought out to show this stuff instead of it just somehow coincidentally didn't get developed. This has happened thousands of times as I spoke about in my previous video. And my adventures with Dennis, and again trading notes with people like Brian and hearing Mark's story and James's story and Elizabeth Rauscher, and again on and on and on. And again, in my mystical studies, etc., I saw this stated in channeled material, etc., which is at the 0 point field, whatever you want to call it. It's divine in nature. And we guess everything is divine, but I believe that the 0 point field is something special. And that if a galactic civilization is not benevolently motivated properly, if they don't have the proper motivation, if it's all about weaponization and greed and stuff, they're either not going to tap it or not tap it for long. And so I believe that the 0 point field is divine. And this is something that, again, slowly sort of dawned on me as I saw all these failed attempts. And what they had in common, which there wasn't enough collective integrity in the efforts to succeed, particularly with what they were up against, and not just the organized suppression, but the inertia of society with all these scientists, it's impossible, all this three-ring circus that's around a situation like this. And so anyway, that's why I advocate the love and enlightenment approach, because it may be the only one that will work. It can't be about, you know, profits and, and becoming the Bill Gates of free energy and all that stuff. I mean, the only thing I think will work is this technology is given to humanity. And once that happens, the world as you know it will end. And to his credit, Stephen Greer understands that, that, and again, anybody who's lived with these ideas long enough understands that the world will end as we know it. And I get into this in my work, and in future videos, I will describe in quite a bit of detail why the world will end as we know it, and a world of abundance will come into being, and a world of abundance and love instead of the scarcity and fear that has been humanity's constant companion. And in fact, I'll cut this short pretty quickly. Um, but as humanity's energy surplus has increased over what I call the epics of the human journey, we become more humane. We're much less violent, much more humane than we used to be, and that's because we could afford to be, because energy powered machines, etc., have greatly reduced our struggles. But again, our primary energy source right now, fossil fuels, have run out fast. And stuff like nuclear fission, yeah, we don't want to do it that way. And so anyway, so that's about all I have to say. And but I'll finish with saying that in what I call the fifth epic, which is the epic based on free energy and abundance. When, and I think we'll see a new kind of human, because nobody will be raised in adversity. And again, everything will change. And science will too. So today's version of science will be seen as very primitive in the fifth epic. Yeah, science in the fifth epic will only bear a faint resemblance to what we see today, or what orthodox science is today. And of course, orthodox scientists don't like hearing that, and that's why this is an exit to them. All their highfalutin theories and stuff. Free energy presents an existential risk to their whole body of theory. And so again, it's their religion. And so who wants to understand their religion's bogus, right? So who wants to, nobody, almost few people are honest enough to actually admit that whatever religion they were indoctrinated into is, it's not the truth. It's something that was a handy way to get their allegiance, so they could be used actually as a cog in the societal machine. But that's something I will get into a lot more later. But anyway, so that's all I have to say for now. And anyway, goodbye.